All right.
Sweet.
Hooray.
Hi, YouTube.
It's a little delay.
Whoa, delay.
Hooray.
My face.
Hi, YouTube.
It's a little delay.
Yeah.
YouTube tab.
Yeah, I'll minimize it. I just gotta send this to Savannah.
Hooray.
My face.
Hi, YouTube.
It's a little delay.
Oh, jeez.
Yeah,
We're
I'll-
gonna get
I'll
sucked in.
minimize it.
Is that going to be the thing the whole time? Is that-
No.
It's a little delay.
We're gonna get sucked in. That was really cool.
More fun for later, another time.
Okay.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Did you give me kombucha this afternoon? Okay, no.
I didn't. I'm sorry.
Okay.
I forgot to get you kombucha.
All right.
Jones said, hey, we
Is
had
it
a
all the way up
kombucha.
volume-wise?
Kombucha's good though.
Yeah, can
It
we,
is now.
can we lock it on him?
It's good stuff for your tummy.
You want to introduce Thomas?
Yes.
Pardon?
Hello.
Hello.
Hey, I'm Thomas. I'm the person who's been texting you.
Okay.
Good to meet you. Do you think we should go around and say who we are, or just save that?
Yeah, let's do it.
We're gonna go around and say who we are, so you know who we are, and then we can get started. Sorry for all the delays. So I'm Thomas. He, him. Everyone just wanted to put your face in.
I'm Becca. They, the, I mean, not, sorry, she, hers.
I'm Micah. They, them.
The camera's here.
Where's the camera?
The camera's here.
There you go.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, I'm Catherine, she, her.
Jeff, he, him.
Erica, she, her.
Jones, he, them.
Caitlin, she, her.
Andy, they, he, him. More, they, them.
All right.
You got Becca too.
Oh yeah, they're coming down.
And then we got other
We
people.
have more friends.
Oh, I don't want my face in this.
Alright,
We're introducing ourselves.
We're just introducing ourselves, so if y'all want to pop your head into the camera and say who you are,
Wait, you can say
pronouns. This is
Savannah.
just sad.
Savannah, yeah.
Savannah, I use she and they pronouns. Hello, thank you for being here.
And just say who you are.
My name is Justin. Yeah.
All right, all set to go.
All right. Thank you so much for the invitation. I wanted to, first of all, give some background information on Walter Rodney, not only as an individual, but to discuss where he came from. All individuals come out of a particular historical and social context. Walter Rodney was born in 1942 in Guyana, which is a country in South America. It's considered part of the English-speaking Caribbean. And he grew up in a progressive family, working-class family. And he had even done some political work as a teenager through his parents. Guyana was a country that underwent a lot of political turmoil during the 1950s. The country is racially diverse from the standpoint that you have both people of African descent as well as people of Asian, South Asian, or Indian descent. I mean, it's a very interesting history. Africans, of course, were brought there during the Atlantic slave trade. After slavery, there was importation of Indian laborers. Rodney wrote about this years later. They, in a sense, were brought there to undercut the value of African agricultural labor. This was in the latter part of the 19th century. And they became a huge population group. And eventually it became a slight majority in Guyana. So you had the African population, you had a large East Indian population, some Chinese, as well as British. So that gives you some background in terms of the demographics of the country. In 1959, Walter Rodney went to the University of the West Indies in Jamaica, and he studied history for 4 years. Then he went to London, England, and studied history again with a special focus on African history. From 1963 to 1966, he studied at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. He focused heavily on West African history and the history of the Atlantic slave trade. He wanted to do primary documentary research. So he learned Portuguese and actually went to Lisbon, Portugal to study in the archives there to write his doctoral dissertation. Now, why did he go to Portugal? Because Portugal and Spain were the first two European countries to be involved in the Atlantic slave trade, beginning in the mid and late 1400s. They were the first to be involved in sending expeditions to West Africa, largely West Africa, then eventually Southern and East Africa as well, as the decades proceeded. So he wanted to study what the Portuguese had actually written, what they had actually documented about their involvement in the Atlantic slave trade. So he published his doctoral dissertation. He finished in 1966. The dissertation was later published by Monthly Review Press around 1970. So anyway, in 1966, after he got his PhD from the University of London, he went to Tanzania in East Africa, to the University of Dar es Salaam. Now, what was the significance of that? The University of Dar es Salaam at that time was the center of revolutionary activity in Africa. It was a country where many national liberation movements had their headquarters. For example, the Mozambique Liberation Front had their offices there, which later took power in 1975 in Mozambique. Also, the Zimbabwe African National Union, ZANU-PF, which is the ruling party in Zimbabwe, they also had offices there. And a number of other liberation movements. The African National Congress was there. The Southwest Africa People's Organization of Namibia was there. So it was a center of national liberation movements. Also at the University of Dar es Salaam, there were a lot of progressive, Marxist, revolutionary scholars and students who were very much interested in revolutionary transformation in Africa and throughout the world. This coincided with a major development in Tanzania in 1967. The ruling party there was, at that time, was called Tanganyika, or the Tanzanian African National Union, and TANU. And in 1967, they issued a document called the Arusha Declaration. It was a socialist document. You can look it up. It's online. And it outlines what socialism would look like in Tanzania. Very interesting document. Talks about public ownership of property, getting guidelines for people who work in government. They were not allowed to own more than one home. They couldn't rent property out. A lot of other things that were quite interesting during the time period. So it was a really very political atmosphere that Walter Rodney was in. He went there in 1966. to teach in the history department there. And there were a lot of other progressive and revolutionary scholars at the University of Dar es Salaam at that time. Then in 1968, he was invited to go back to the Caribbean. He went to the University of the West Indies in Jamaica at Mona, where he had gone to undergraduate school, to teach as a visiting scholar. Okay, this is 1968. So this was at the height of the Black Power movement, which also impacted the Caribbean. It initiated here in the United States with the SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which organized the first Black Panther Party in Alabama. And then you had the urban rebellions starting in 1964 in New York and New Jersey. Then you had the Watts Rebellion of 1965, the rebellion in Chicago in 1966, while Martin Luther King was there with the Chicago Freedom Movement. 67, there were rebellions in over 160 cities throughout the United States, Detroit being the largest. Then in 68, of course, the rebellions continued. You had the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. 50 years ago. And Chicago was one of the largest rebellions in response to the assassination of Martin Luther King 50 years ago last week. So this is the type of atmosphere that was going on in 1968. Rodney was teaching at the University of West Indies in Jamaica, but he was also working, doing lectures, rallies, working with the Black Power movement in Jamaica, all right? So the Jamaican government, which was a neo-colonial government at the time, was heavily influenced by Britain and the United States, saw him as a threat, and he left the country to go to Montreal for a Black Writers Conference that was held in August of 1968, I believe. And all the major Black intellectuals and writers and activists were there. People like James Baldwin, C.L.R. James, Stokely Carmichael. They were all there speaking at this conference. And then when he came back to Jamaica, he was not allowed to re-enter the country. And then there was a rebellion there in response to that. So he went back to Tanzania in 1968 to teach at the University of Dar es Salaam. And then he taught there for several years. As I mentioned, in 1970, his doctoral dissertation was published. And then in 1972, he published How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. It was published by the Tanzanian government. So that means he had quite a considerable amount of influence in the country. And of course, the book generated a lot of discussion at the time. And also, it was attacked, by the mainstream academic community as being too politicized, not relying enough on primary source documents. These are like academic arguments against the book, but they saw it as a threat. And Rodney's response was that he did not write the book for other scholars. The book was written for activists. It was written for people working in the civil service. It was written for students, people involved in the struggle. Even though he was trained in the academic community, he was quite clear that that book was written for students, working class people, people involved in the national liberation movements, involved in the struggle for socialism, and so forth. So that brings us up to 1972. He was involved in a lot of real heavy stuff at that time period. People like Sam Nujoma of SWAPO, they knew him personally. He did seminars, with a lot of the leading revolutionary guerrilla organizations. Then he was invited back to the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor in 1972 to be a visiting scholar for a semester. And of course, after that, he went back to Tanzania. He stayed there another 2 years. And then he decided he wanted to go back to Guyana, where he was born, in the Caribbean. he was actually offered a teaching position at the university in Guyana. So he goes there, and when he arrives, he realizes that his teaching position, the offer had been rescinded, that the Guyanese government had put pressure on the university there not to allow him to teach at the University of Guyana. So he's there, and he doesn't have a job. So in effect, they wanted him to leave. The government of Forbes Burnham, all right? So he refuses to leave. He says he's going to stay there and do political work. So he starts working among the various Pan-African groups, socialist organizations in both the African and Indian communities in an effort to bring together these communities because they had been split apart. You had two major parties, the People's Progressive Party, which also claimed to be socialists, but it was dominated by people from India. Shetty Jagan was the Secretary General. They were closely allied with the Soviet Union. You also had the People's National Congress, the PNC, which was headed by Forbes Burnham, which was a party dominated by people of African descent. And they also said they were socialists. So what he wanted to do was bring together both the African and Indian community into an alliance or into a new political party. So eventually they started this group called the Working People's Alliance, the WPA, which the government of Forbes Burnham saw as a threat. And in 1979, Rodney and some of his comrades were framed, well, they were attempting to frame them for burning down a government building. A government building had been burned in Guyana, and they said he was involved in it, so he was indicted for this crime. And then the following year, he was assassinated. He was given a, well, somebody had infiltrated his organization, and he was given a walkie-talkie to test. They were testing some communications equipment, and it had been rigged with an explosive. And it blew up, and he died. The government said that he was attempting to blow up a building in Guyana, which they never provided any proof that that was the case. So that's basically a short snapshot of Walter Rodney's life, his intervention in various political struggles in the Caribbean, in Europe, in East Africa and Tanzania, and then back to the Caribbean. So does anybody have any questions or comments about this before we discuss the chapter?
Did the Working People's Alliance continue after his death? Or like how long did that continue?
Yeah, the party is still going now. In fact, they do have people in the government in Guyana. So it did have longevity, you know, after his assassination, but it was a big blow, not only to the WPA, but to the revolutionary movement in the Caribbean as a whole, and the overall struggle internationally. Rodney was a towering figure during the 1970s as a scholar. He not only wrote How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, but he also wrote a lot of articles, gave a lot of addresses at different universities and conferences, which were published and widely circulated. So it was a major loss to the African Revolution, to the broader struggle for socialism worldwide. And but he made his mark. That's why today people are still reading his work. You know, there's still people trying to carry on his legacy. Just about 3 weeks ago, his widow, Patricia, and one of his former comrades from Jamaica, Jerry Small, and Robert Hill, who's a scholar who retired from the University of California at Los Angeles, who's a literary executive for Marcus Garvey's work, and C.L.R. James. They visited Detroit. I got a chance to see them at the African American Museum about 3 weeks ago. They had a special event to commemorate the birthday, 76th birthday, what would have been the 76th birthday of Walter Rodney. He was born on March 23rd of 1942, and he was killed on June 13th of 1980. So he was only 38 years old when he was assassinated. Yeah. Any other questions or comments about his background? Yeah, go ahead.
Did he ever spend any time in Cuba, or like did he have relationships with like revolutionary leaders in Cuba, being in the Caribbean?
You know, I'm not sure. Actually, I'm not sure if he visited Cuba. I know he had great admiration for the Cuban Revolution, but no, I have to go back and look that up to see if he actually visited Cuba. No, I'm not sure.
Okay.
Yeah. Anyone else have any questions? Okay, well, this chapter that you've selected for today is a very, very interesting chapter. It's the last chapter of How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. And the whole title of it, Colonialism as a System for Underdeveloping Africa, just the title itself is quite intriguing. Walter Rodney was a Marxist. He used a dialectical historical materialist approach to chronicling African developments. His primary emphasis was on the underdevelopment of Africa. And of course, through the underdevelopment of Africa, Europe was able to develop and become dominant within the world system. Prior to the 15th century, Europe, Western Europe in particular, was not the dominant geopolitical region in the world economic system. The world economic system was largely centered around what is known as the Indian Ocean Basin, off the coast of East Africa, across to Asia, up through the Middle East. This was the major trading routes. This is where the center of development had been concentrated for many centuries, until the advent of the Atlantic slave trade, which began during the 15th century and accelerated tremendously after that. Now, I mentioned Portugal and Spain as being the first Western European countries which were involved in the Atlantic slave trade, and they set up colonies. A lot of the colonies they set up were in the Caribbean and in South America. Brazil, for example, a huge country. They have like the 4th largest population of any other country in the world. Also has the largest concentration of people of African descent outside of Africa. Brazil was a Portuguese colony for centuries. Slavery there ended, it was the last country in the Western Hemisphere to have slavery. Slavery really didn't end in Brazil until 1888, 1889. We're talking about almost 24 years after slavery ended in the United States. I mean, just think about that. I mean, slavery ended in the United States after the Civil War in 1865, but it went on in Cuba up until about the early 1880s. And it also went on in Brazil even further than that. In Brazil, they had a monarchy that was in control, a Portuguese monarchy. And of course, that was overthrown in a rebellion around 1888. And as part of that rebellion, they ended the practice of slavery. So if you think about it from a historical standpoint, it really hasn't been a long time. We're talking about 1888, 1889, that slavery was abolished in the Western Hemisphere. So Rodney looks at the growth and development of Western Europe and consequently North America as a byproduct of the underdevelopment of Africa through the Atlantic slave trade and also through colonialism. And he was following other scholars, other activists, such as W.B. Du Bois, who wrote Black Reconstruction in America, that was published in 1935 during the Great Depression. Another great book you may want to, study. I don't know if you've already studied it sometime in the future. Capitalism and Slavery by Eric Williams. Eric Williams was from Trinidad in the Caribbean. He linked the rise of capitalism to the profits accrued from the Atlantic slave trade. So these are people that influenced Walter Rodney and his work in the 1970s. So in this chapter, as I mentioned before, he's challenging the whole notion that colonialism brought benefits to the African continent. He's not looking at a spreadsheet, for example, or a balance sheet. He mentions it in this chapter, and I'll just read a few paragraphs, and then we can have other people read, or we can have further discussion. Part 1 of this chapter is entitled The Supposed Benefits of Colonialism to Africa. It says, faced with the evidence of European exploitation of Africa, many bourgeois writers would concede, at least partially, that colonialism was a system which functioned well in the interests of the metropoles. When he says metropoles, he means the European imperialist centers, Germany, France, Britain, Portugal, Spain, and later, of course, the United States and Canada. However, they would then urge that another issue to be resolved is how much Europeans did for Africans. And that is necessary to draw up a, quote, balance sheet of colonialism, unquote. This is a very important notion. On that balance sheet, they place both the, quote, credits and the, quote, debits, and quite often conclude that the good outweighed the bad. So you hear people say, well, even though slavery was bad, it brought African people into Western Christianity, which is really historically fallacious anyway, because the first Christian church was set up in Egypt in 70 AD. And the Orthodox Christian church existed long before the Roman Catholic Church. And there was a split between the Roman Church and the Orthodox Church. But people still make these fallacious arguments. The particular conclusion can quite easily be challenged, but attention should be drawn to the fact that the process of reasoning is itself misleading. The reasoning has some sentimental persuasiveness. It appeals to the common sentiment that, quote, after all, there must be two sides to a thing, unquote. The argument suggests that on the one hand, there was exploitation and oppression. But on the other hand, colonial governments did much for the benefit of Africans as they developed Africa. Now he goes on to take up this notion. He says, it is our contention that this is completely false. Colonialism had only one hand. It was a one-armed bandit, meaning it took and it virtually gave nothing back. And the only thing it gave back, the things that it did give back were designed to facilitate the profit-making capacity of European imperialism. Then he asks, what did colonial governments do in the interests of Africans? Supposedly they built railroads, schools, hospitals, and the like. The sum total, he goes on to say, of what they actually built was minuscule. He deals with this in the passages that follow. For the first 3 decades of colonialism, hardly anything was done that could remotely be termed a service to the African people. He's talking about the period of the late 1800s, early 1900s. The Berlin Conference was in 1884, 1885, held in Germany. All the European colonial powers were involved, including the United States. After that, there were enormous atrocities that were committed all across Africa, in the Congo, in what's today known as Namibia, and Rhodesia, what is today known as Zimbabwe. Millions of people lost their lives. Enormous amounts of wealth was extracted in terms of mineral wealth, also agricultural wealth, and labor was extracted from the masses of the people. He goes on to say it was in fact only after the last war, meaning World War II, that social services were built as a matter of policy. How little they amounted to does not really need illustrating. After all, the statistics which show that Africa today is underdeveloped are the statistics representing the state of affairs at the end of colonialism. For that matter, the figures at the end of the first decade of African independence in spheres such as health, housing, and education are often several times higher than the figures inherited by the newly independent governments. It would be an act of the most brazen fraud to weigh the paltry social amenities provided during the colonial epoch against the exploitation and to arrive at the conclusion that the good outweighed the bad. He says capitalism did bring social services to European workers, meaning the people who went there to work for the colonial system, to manage the colonial system, firstly as a byproduct of providing such services for the bourgeoisie and the middle class, and later as a deliberate act of policy. Nothing remotely comparable occurred in Africa. He goes on to say that in 1934, long before the coming of the welfare state to Britain, expenditure for social services in the British Isles amounted to about £6.15 per person. In Ghana, the figure was 7.4D per person, and that was high by colonial standards. In Nigeria and Nyasaland, Nigeria is in West Africa. Nyasaland is today Malawi, which is in Southeast Africa. It was less than 1.9D per head. None of the other colonizing powers were doing any better, and some were doing much worse. The Portuguese stand out because they boasted the most and did the least. Portugal boasted that Angola, Guinea, and Mozambique have been their possessions for 500 years, during which time a, quote, civilizing mission, unquote, has been going on. At the end of the 500 years of shouldering the white man's burden of civilizing, quote, African natives, unquote, the Portuguese had not managed to train one single African doctor in Mozambique. And the life expectancy in eastern Angola, which was also a Portuguese colony, was less than 30 years. So this is a genocidal policy of colonialism. As for Guinea-Bissau, which is in West Africa, was also a Portuguese colony. Some insights into the situation there is provided by the admission of the Portuguese themselves that Guinea-Bissau was more neglected than Angola and Mozambique. Now this is quite interesting because Portugal, as I mentioned before, was one of the first, along with Spain, to be involved in the Atlantic slave trade and colonialism. But they were later surpassed by other Western European countries. For example, the Netherlands was heavily involved through the Dutch East Indian Company in the Atlantic slave trade and colonialism. Also, France superseded both Spain and Portugal. And also Germany, for a considerable amount of time, it superseded them as well. Although after World War I, Germany lost all of their colonies in Africa. And because they were defeated in the war. And then, of course, the fascists used this during the 1920s and 1930s to build their movement. They eventually took over in 1933. Britain, for example, Britain superseded Portugal and Spain. So Spain and Portugal were like the least underdeveloped imperialist and colonial powers during the latter part of the classical period of colonialism. So anyway, people have any questions or comments in response to those first couple of pages of the chapter? You see where he's heading. He's saying, hey, look, they may say that colonialism brought transportation, they brought social services to Africa, but it was a pittance in regard to what was taken out of the continent by the imperialists themselves. And, the same arguments could be made about slavery in the United States, that they used to justify this by saying that, well, it brought Black people into Christianity. Yeah. It brought them into Western, what became known as Western civilization. But look what they took, 250 years of unpaid labor, the breaking up of families, the super exploitation of people's labor, the literal genocidal conditions under which people lived during slavery, even in North America. So anyway, anybody has any questions or comments so far?
Yeah, I mean, I think this kind of connects to something that he says later, which is like, commission investigating the grievances found the grievances so shocking that the full findings were not published during the war, lest they reveal that colonialism was hardly any better than the fascism against which Britain was fighting. So I guess my kind of question is, like, to me, that kind of seems like a rosy view of what, like, British people in Britain would even care about. Like, to say that British people, like, if they really knew the depths of tragedy of, the exploitation of African workers, that they would have somehow, like, believed that to be equal, or that they would have cared about that. Like, I guess I kind of just wonder, like, I don't know, that seems like a rosy way to look at it. Like, they would have seen this as almost equal to fascism that they were fighting. Like, I don't know.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Some people probably would have been impacted by it, because you had left-wing forces in Britain that were sympathetic to the anti-colonial struggle. For example, people like C.L.R. James and George Padmore, two other figures who were from the Caribbean as well, lived in Britain during the 1930s and 1940s. And they were doing work in opposition to the Italian intervention in Ethiopia, which took place in 1935. They took over Ethiopia for about 6 years, killed a lot of people. Italy, which of course lost its colonies as well, a lot of them, well, they were severely challenged during World War I, because they had colonies in Libya, in Somalia, and also in other parts of Africa. Eritrea, of course, was an Italian colony as well. And then they went in and took over Ethiopia. So there was a huge movement after 1935 in England, as well as the United States, against the fascist occupation of Ethiopia under Mussolini. And that movement was largely led by people like C.L.R. James and George Padmore. And they did get support among elements within the left in Britain during that time period. So yes, it could have had an impact because this whole notion that Britain and France were more malevolent or liberal imperialists, whereas the Germans and the Italians and Spain and Portugal were more vicious or more authoritarian. The argument breaks down at a certain point because the British had much more to lose in terms of their colonies in Africa and in other parts of the world because they had become dominant in terms of the world imperialist system. Any other comments?
Well, I think, like, who knows how the British would have reacted, but I think it's saying something that they declined to release the findings.
Yeah.
Like, I think, who knows how they would have reacted. Maybe it would have been big, maybe it would have been small. But just the fact that they were afraid to release the findings of their report, I think, you know.
Yeah, but I had a question about someplace in this chapter he talks about how the worst justifications for colonialism that he was refuting, that professors were and scholars were beginning to be careful about how they express themselves on some of these points. And so you might have thought that there would be continued progress in that regard in terms of discourse after he published this book and everything. But it seems to me that starting maybe in the 80s in the Reagan-Thatcher area, there was a sort of a counter-revolution in this regard, to the point where we now have a president that talks about shithole countries.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's kind of a connection between Trump's attitude toward things today in that regard and the kind of stuff that Rodney was trying to fight against back in the 70s.
Yes. Even at that time, there was a big struggle inside the African studies field. African studies was largely started during the 1950s in the mainstream universities as a mechanism for understanding and also influencing the African independence process. So it was controversial from that standpoint. And some of the people who were involved in setting it up were not necessarily opposed to imperialism. They saw another type of civilizing mission for the United States, which after World War II clearly became the dominant imperialist country in the world. They were to a large degree after World War I, but clearly after World War II, with the destruction of so much industrial manufacturing bases in Europe, Germany was destroyed. You had the growth also of the Soviet Union after the revolution in 1917, but it became stronger. The Soviet Union was in a much, much stronger position after World War II. So in the 1960s, you had a lot of African-American scholars who came on the scene, students as well as scholars who challenged a lot of the ideas, a lot of the assumptions of these mainstream so-called Africanist scholars, many of whom were white. So there was a formation of the African Studies Association in the United States, and people were dissatisfied with the way in which a lot of things were operating. So they broke away and started forming their own separate organizations. Even the Black Studies movement in the United States in the 1960s. 1968 was a big year where students all over the country in universities, but also in high schools as well, started to demonstrate, starting to put forward demands, take over buildings, demanding Black studies, Black history, to learn more about Black culture and social sciences from a perspective of the oppressed people. So, yes, it was forced largely upon the mainstream universities in the 1960s. They did not want it at all, but it was part and parcel of a broader movement. The Civil Rights Movement, the Black Power Movement, the Black Revolutionary Movement. It was a part of that whole struggle. So they conceded to some of these demands, like setting up Black Studies centers, departments, cultural centers, agreeing to hire Black faculty members, and agreeing to impose affirmative action programs. For example, at the University of Michigan in 1970 was the first Black action movement that was set up there, where the small number of African-American students, with the assistance of Students for a Democratic Society and other progressive forces among the white students, took over buildings and effectively shut down the university, demanding that the university embark upon a affirmative action program to raise the level of enrollment by 1975 to 10%. Now, they never reached that goal. They still haven't reached it today. It's even worse now since affirmative action has been primarily outlawed through various methods, through the courts, and also through referendums. So yeah, we've seen a retrograde process within the academic community now. And there are a number of reasons for that. You got a right-wing, whole right-wing movement right now in the United States. It's impacted the universities. Plus, there's been huge cutbacks in funding for universities as well. The capitalist system now is recognizing that they don't need as many educated and skilled people as they probably thought they needed in the period immediately after World War II. So all these variables are very, very important to understand what is going on now in the universities. And plus, with the decline of Black and brown students as well, it's still very difficult to push for these demands when students have been systematically driven out of the colleges and universities across the United States. So yeah, you're right. It's clearly a right-wing trend that's going on now. And, with Trump in office and the recent budget that he put forward, the tax cuts that he's put forward, obviously it's going to get worse. We see the cutbacks in the universities. We see the cutbacks in public education. That's why the teachers are striking in various states across the U.S. Their salaries are decreasing. The physical infrastructure of the schools are collapsing. So yes, this is a major problem in 2018. Yes, most definitely. Yeah, any other questions or comments about the book, the chapter? Go ahead, yes.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't help but be reminded of the echoes of civilizing missions and paltry social services and current nonprofit excursions into Africa.
Yeah.
As a form of neocolonialism, which I think has been discussed a lot in academic publications, but that just really rang true. Looking at this text and comparing it to the infomercials that are on super late at night, the language even is really similar, and the fact that we see these threads at the origin of the transatlantic slave trade and other slave trades, and it just continues unbroken through the neocolonialism that we're in today. So have scholars picked up on specifically this text and connected it to neocolonialism through NGOs and nonprofits?
Yes, definitely. And even before this book was published, Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, who was the first president of Ghana in West Africa, he wrote a book called Neocolonialism, The Last Stage of Imperialism. And if you read that book, particularly the last chapter.
Yeah, we read that for the study group, just so you know.
Great.
Yeah.
He talks about the role of the Peace Corps, U.S. Aid, and all these other groups. And there are even more of them now. You mentioned the non-governmental organizations, the NGOs. They're funded by the West, and they go to many African countries ostensibly to do humanitarian work. Some of them do decent work, but at the same time, a lot of the things they are doing there is undermining the working class and popular struggles that are taking place on the continent. They take people out of these struggles. They employ them in these agencies, yet at the same time, there are strict limits on what they can do when they're employed by these particular non-governmental organizations. And some of them, of course, are outright fronts for imperialist intrigue in Africa. They've been involved in overthrowing progressive governments, undermining progressive movements on the continent. So it's a major, major problem. It's ongoing from the 1960s. Here we are 50 years later, and we're still facing similar problems. You know, I've written about this. For example, there was growth in many African economies over the last 10 years, largely because of the findings in minerals and energy resources. A lot more oil is being discovered, natural gas, and other types of natural resources and strategic minerals. And these resources and minerals and even agricultural products are being exported to the West. Well, what happened 4 years ago? We had a precipitous decline in commodity prices on the international market. And what was the impact of this? It meant that these African countries, Ghana, for example, Nigeria, South Africa, Kenya, Tanzania, Mozambique, they suffered immensely because the prices declined, for example, in oil, and their foreign exchange reserves virtually dried up. So Nigeria, which is the largest populated state in Africa, went into a recession. South Africa went into a recession. They're supposed to be reemerging now, but it's very, very difficult. The US government, under the previous president, Barack Obama, who lives in Chicago, had a plan, along with his advisors, to enhance production of domestic production of energy resources, hydraulic fracking for natural gas. You had increased oil exploration inland as well as offshore, shale oil production and so forth. This flooded the oil market and natural gas market internationally and drove down the prices by 2/3. So a lot of these countries that were relying, their growth was based on the trade of these natural resources to the West, began to fall in deep debt and deep economic crisis. I just published an article recently about what's going on in Mozambique, where their country is very rich in terms of resources, but now, because of the decline in commodity prices, they have to restructure their economy. The loans that they had taken out, they cannot meet the terms of repayment, and therefore they have to set new terms. The International Monetary Fund recently sent a delegation there to advise them on how to restructure their debt. So it's still going on. This is neo-colonialism. This is the new form of colonialism that is the major impediment to African development and development throughout the emerging economies. We tend to call them the oppressed nations, but it's a major, major problem that's taking place right now. And until we have socialism in Africa on a continental-wide basis, as Dr. Kwame Nkrumah talked about, we're going to continue to have these problems. Let's look at China, for example. What was their response to the economic crisis 10 years ago? They took 15% of their gross domestic product to reinvest into their national economy, to create new jobs, new industries. And this was very instrumental in turning the situation around in China. They're the second largest economy right now internationally. Now, under Trump, he's talking about imposing trade tariffs on China. Of course, China is responding to that. And you see all this volatility on the stock market over the last couple of weeks. It's a direct result of the economic policy of. Now, they're claiming they want to negotiate with China now. This is what the Trump administration is saying, because they know, or they should know, that if China imposes steep tariffs on products that are exported from the United States to China, this will impact farmers, for example, in regard to agricultural products. It's going to impact the people who manufacture luxury goods to export to China. It's going to impact them as well. So there's going to be layoffs. There's going to be a decline in wages, and possibly another recession, which this time could be much more severe than it was the one that began some 10 years ago. So the stuff that Rodney wrote about in 1972 and during the 1970s, in terms of the dialectical relationship between development and underdevelopment, is still very much relevant today. Africa is underdeveloped because it has been underdeveloped by the imperialist countries. Even today, the fact that the imperialists still control the terms of international trade is a major impediment. They found all this oil, all this natural gas, all these other strategic minerals in Africa over the last decade, all along the East African coast, from Somalia all the way down to Kenya, Tanzania, and Mozambique. Natural gas, oil, that they want to develop and exploit. But if the prices are down, and if the African countries cannot get adequate payment for their resources, and if they still have to be dependent upon the extension of credit by the imperialist countries, then of course they're still going to be dependent. So this is why you have groups like ALBA, for example, in Latin America, as an alternative method for loaning money to people for economic planning. But look what's happened in Venezuela in the last few years with the decline in oil prices and the outright sabotage by US imperialism of the Bolivarian revolution's economy. So now you have a situation in Venezuela where the class struggle is intensifying between those who are fighting for socialism and those who are in the US imperialist camp. Also BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Another international organization that was established to facilitate greater cooperation, trade, participation among countries of the South, among the emerging economies of the so-called oppressed nations. You have the Africa, South America grouping as well. States, Association of African and South American States, that was started by people like Muammar Gaddafi and Hugo Chavez. It was started about a decade ago. They've had about 3 conferences. All right. Last one, I believe, was in Equatorial Guinea in West Africa. So there's a lot of things that are going on. A lot of these countries are talking among themselves, and they are attempting to develop new methods of trade, new methods of cooperation, and so forth. Yet, as long, in my opinion, as long as they stay within the system of capitalism and world imperialism, there's always going to be roadblocks. The workers have to be empowered. The youth have to be empowered. The farmers have to be empowered in all of these geopolitical regions in order to bring about the conditions for socialism on an international level. We see it. We see the seeds of it taking place, but it's still got to be a major struggle waged. You know, we see the threats of war against the DPRK, against Venezuela. These tariffs being threatened against China, these are acts of war by imperialism against a socialist state. Even if the state is not socialist, it's still within the emerging community, within the oppressed nations. So really, these are acts of war against the overwhelming majority of people on Earth. Any other comments or questions?
In that vein, one of the most interesting parts of the reading to me was when he talks about how in Africa, capitalism did not create an urbanized proletariat. Could you talk a little bit about that and about like the political underdevelopment?
Well, it depends. I mean, in Ghana, they had a trade union movement that arose out of the Railroad Workers Union and also in mining. In Nigeria, you have a trade union movement there as well. In the oil sector, it exists in the education sector. South Africa has a huge, which is the most industrialized state because of the character of colonialism there. They have a huge working class there and a huge, powerful trade union movement. Congress of South African Trade Unions. It has over 1 million members. But at the same time, you have a large peasantry and an agricultural or rural proletariat as well. A lot of people are still involved in subsistence farming. And there are other people who are involved in the mass production of agricultural commodities. For example, in South Africa, in the Western Cape, they produce wine. You know, some of the best wines in the world are produced there, but they're produced largely through these large agricultural companies that employ thousands upon thousands of African workers. So it's a different type of a class structure, but it's still a class structure that exists. You have the notion of a rural proletariat or agricultural working class is a reality from the standpoint that even in the United States, if you look at slavery, particularly after the early 19th century, through the conclusion of slavery, and Dr. W.B. Du Bois talks about this in his book, Black Reconstruction, the slaves were in essence a Black working class. One of the chapters in the book is entitled The Black Workers, and he talks about how it was a proletariat that picked the cotton, that was involved in cultivating the cotton, and cotton, of course, was the major agricultural product in the United States for domestic as well as export. And it was key in the development of the textile industry in Europe as well as the United States. So, you know, African people have been essential as a working class in regard to propping up and creating the conditions for the super exploitation of their labor and also the profit-making capacity of the world capitalist system. And out of this, in terms of what Eric Williams talked about in his book, Capitalism and Slavery, that was published in 1944, all of the major capitalist industries, he traces them back to the profits accrued from the Atlantic slave trade. For example, he talks about shipping. The whole development of the system of international shipping was fueled by the profits accrued from the Atlantic slave trade, which of course led to the development of steam technology directly into industrial production in the 19th century, and of course the 20th century with mass production in the 20th century, Taylorism, Fordism, etc. Banking, he also talks about banking. Its origins in Britain is clearly tied with the profits accrued from the exploitation of African labor. And clearly we can see it here in the United States. I mean, the whole basis for the demand for reparations is the 250 years of unpaid labor of African people, which built both the agricultural and industrial fabric of U.S. capitalism and imperialism. The United States would never have become an economic power if it had not been for the forced removal of indigenous people from the land, and their largely extermination, and the importation and super exploitation of African people. This is what built the United States into an industrial power. Of course, there was exploitation of European American workers as well, and also Asian, particularly Chinese workers, who helped build the railroads and who helped do other type of really slave labor during the 19th century. You had the Chinese Exclusion Act. People may want to go and look that up. I mean, these were racist laws to control various oppressed groups for the explicit purpose of the exploitation of their labor. Yeah, so these are very important issues as Marxists, as Leninists, for us to grapple with. What is the basis of our existence? If we want socialism, we have to be able to organize the workers and the oppressed to transform the system from capitalism to socialism. So where's our base? Our base obviously is among the working class and among the nationally oppressed, among the farmers and among the youth. And these are the social forces that we have to go among and work among, attempt to organize, to do political education work, and to learn from as well. So this is very, very important that we understand the history of capitalism and imperialism, the history of racism and its origins in the Western world, and also how do these historical factors impact us today? It's still going on. It's still continuing. People are still being exploited. Low-wage labor in the United States right now is the basis for what is considered economic stability in this country. We talk about job creation in the United States. A lot of the jobs that are being created are low-wage jobs in the service sector, hospitality sector, the restaurant sector, where a lot of the workers are not even paid a minimum wage. Yet they're still considered to be fully employed. I mean, this is a contradiction. So this is why we've been relating to the movement for the raising of the minimum wage, and also the movements that are going on now to organize low-wage workers, and many workers right now being forced into that category of the working class. You see what the teachers are doing in all these states. It's almost impossible conditions under which they are working. So these are some of the issues that we need to be looking at and trying to understand as we move out to organize more people and to build a revolutionary party in this country. That's what is missing right now. A lot of people want to fight. They want to struggle. But, we need a mechanism to channel that energy. And so it becomes a real dynamic class struggle. The imperialist system is not as stable and as strong as they purport it to be. Otherwise, they would not be engaging in these wars. They would not be threatening trade tariffs against China and other countries if they were strong and secure. These are manifestations of their instability and their weaknesses, and we have to figure out a mechanism of exploiting their weaknesses and their insecurities to benefit our class.
Great. Thank you. Wrap us up, Thomas.
So that's, you can't see me. I'm on some stairs now.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for the invitation. So are y'all coming to Detroit this weekend?
Yeah.
Okay, we're looking forward to seeing you.
I see you.
On Friday.
Thank you.
We have an action-packed weekend set up, and some of the youth comrades were there tonight. I was just at the office fixing the upstairs of our building, doing some repairs and stuff. And so we're looking forward to continuing this discussion and building this party.
Thank you.
Thanks, Abayomi. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye, thank you.
We're still going to be on live until you stop.